Alright guys, what is the crack? You are very welcome to another episode of the From the Depths podcast. As always, my name is Emmett, and you're very welcome to another week of the show. So, I've been promising this now for 2 weeks. I didn't put out a new episode last Friday, as I released one very early last week. So it's been a little over a week now since I've made an episode for you guys. But hopefully this one is worth the wait. I am going to be sitting down and I am going to be talking about the first of George Romero's Dead series, is that how you call it? Do you call it the Dead series? I'm not too sure. But we're talking about the seminal horror classic Night of the Living Dead here on this week's episode of the From the Depths podcast. So, I've been saying this now for a few episodes that I was going to sit down and talk about horror movies and get into horror movies and discuss movies and all that type of crack over a few episodes of the show. So, like I said on last week's show, my laptop is currently out of commission, so I can't really do Zoom calls as such. So the few of those I had planned around certain movies, they've just been pushed back by a few weeks. So I'm using this opportunity to talk about a few horror films that I'm already quite familiar with. And this film in particular, Night of the Living Dead, is actually not just one of my favourite horror movies of all time, because I don't really have a good eye or ear for horror because I'm not too much of a horror connoisseur, but this is definitely one of my top 10 films of all time. I love Night of the Living Dead from back to front. I can recite this film dialogue wise, I'd nearly say to perfection and not miss a beat. I've seen this movie quite a lot. My history with horror is not the best. I'm not a huge horror connoisseur, like I said there. It's not out of intentional ignorance or anything like that. As a young fella, I was super fucking scared of horror films. And what was gas is I never even really saw them. What threw it off for me was I remember, I don't know if many of you remember this, but the mid-2000s, there used to be this program on TV3, which is now Virgin, and it used to be, basically they would be going on about what was going to be on in the cinemas over the next week or two. And they'd play like trailers and stuff like that. And I remember seeing the trailer for, God, was this 2004 or 5? But it was for The Seed of Chucky, the last of the original Chucky series, or the original Child Play series, I should say. And I remember thinking, oh, that doesn't look too bad. Do you know what I mean? And of course, they're not going to show any of the murder on national Irish television. And I remember my uncle was able to suss pirate copy DVDs for new releases, anything we wanted and everything. So he asked my mum to ask us what films did we want, and I was just like trying to show off to my older sister, because my older sister's always been a big horror nut. I was like, oh, you should definitely get us Seed of Chucky if you can get it for us. So my sister had a lot of friends over and everything like this, and there was two particular kills in that film that scared the absolute bejesus out of me. But you know, you can't act scared obviously in front of like the older kids. My sister's about 3 years older than me, so all of her friends would have been obviously 3 years older than me too. And I was sitting there, and there was one where Chucky just literally pounces on this one in the shower and stabs the shit out of her. And there was another one then where your man picks up Chucky, and Chucky is like totally inanimate, and he's just like, oh, what a disgusting doll. And then Chucky just starts stabbing him in the face. But that scared the absolute shit out of me when I was about 8 years of age. To the point then where even before that, I can even go back a little bit earlier, with horror movies, we used to, the rental place in Ennis years ago, obviously before streaming was the thing, we had a VHS and DVD rental store called Pace Video. And when I was very, very young, I'd like to say about 3 or 4 years of age, and my father and my sister and my older sister would be the ones who would always pick out what we would watch when I was that much younger anyway. But I used to have this weird fascination with going up to, I remember it so vividly, there was a stand of old VHSs. If you're old enough to remember this now, you remember there used to be those wooden stands, there'd be 3 to 5 rows in it. And I remember so vividly, like some of the old Hammer horrors being on that shelf. I remember some of the Universal ones. I specifically remember seeing a VHS sleeve to The Invisible Man. That's one I definitely remember seeing. The irony in that, I remember seeing The Invisible Man. But one in particular now, I used to always try and have a gander at whenever I could. No intention of it. I had no intention of ever watching it because the cover scared me so much. Was ironically An American Werewolf in London, and it was, the front of it is fine. The front of it is, you know, him as the wolf barking at the moon. It was more the back of it, where there's that really, really famous scene in that film. It's one of the few horror movies I've seen now, and I wouldn't even, would you really, it is a horror classic, but I'd consider that more a horror comedy in the grand scheme of things. I haven't seen it in a long, long time. But that scene where towards the end of the film, the main guy is in the porno theatre, and all the people he's killed as the werewolf are sitting in the porno theatre with him. You know, you have a couple who are nearly totally severed. You have his friend who's been popping up throughout the film. At this point, he's totally decomposed. The fucking visual effects in are fantastic. He's like green, his eyes are like popping out of the socket. He has no lips, his teeth are just like totally wide all the time. Now I didn't see them film until I was a teenager, I'd say. But yeah, the still of the fella sitting on the chair all decomposed, it scared the shit out of me when I was younger. But I used to be like just fucking staring at it. Same with the Nightmare on Elm Street films too. Freddy Krueger scared the absolute shit out of me at about 10 or 11 years of age. To the point I remember for like 2 weeks I couldn't sleep, and that was just from looking at the DVD sleep. If I had actually watched those films when I was younger, I would have lost my fucking life. But that's kind of why I wanted to use the podcast as an excuse to jump into horror. Horror is one of those things that I think is fucking incredibly interesting, and I've always throughout my life I've been looking at horror from the outside. Obviously as I'm older and stuff like that, I'm a big film nut. I love watching films and stuff like that, and I love like the history of cinema and everything like that. And horror is one of those things. I know a lot about the history of horror, and I know a lot about like how certain films are made and the influence that certain films had on the genre as a whole and stuff like that. Particular shout outs there to like Friday the 13th and like Halloween, inventing like the slasher genre and stuff like that. But this film that I'm talking about today now in particular was now more than ever you can see the effects that this film has had on cinema and stuff like that. We're probably at the end of it now, but for the better part of the last 10 maybe 15 years there was definitely a resurgence in popularity for zombie movies. But actually I take that back, it'd probably be 20 years now this has been going on, because I know like you had it in the 80s. Obviously there was a lot of zombie movies coming out in the 80s, died down a little in the 90s, and then you had, I can't think the name of it now off the top of my head, but you had that was it 28 days later? I could have the number wrong. The one with Cillian Murphy, I know that kind of brought back zombies in a bit of a way. And then Romero released 2 or 3 more in the Dead series, and then of course you had like The Walking Dead, and then just zombies fucking blew up like that from 2010 on. But yeah, to the best of my knowledge, has died down. I think slashers are coming back quite a bit, especially in the wake of Terrifier. When Terrifier came out, I know that had a big impact on a lot of people and stuff like that. And I know the sequel is on the way out, but sure, look, if I start going on about what I know about horror now with this rate, I'm just going to be talking at my hoop. This is the entire point this is the entire reason that I'm using the podcast as an excuse to jump into horror and stuff like that. So look, if you are a horror connoisseur and you have films that you think I should check out over the course of this podcast existence, do feel free to get in touch via the From the Depths Instagram page or the Facebook. I would suggest get in touch via Facebook. And quicker to, or not Facebook, get in touch via Instagram. I'm quicker to respond on Instagram than I am on Facebook. And sometimes Facebook doesn't allow me to respond to messages through the page too. I've noticed this because people have had to get in contact with me directly about, like, you know, about playing music by the band and stuff like this, or giving them a shout out and everything like this. They have to go to like my own personal Facebook, which is absolutely fine. I have no problem with that whatsoever, like, do you know what I mean? But yeah, Instagram, best way to get in contact with me via From the Depths. I'll get the housekeeping out of the way actually before we do anything else on this week's show. If you have been enjoying the podcasts over the past few months, or if this is your first time listening, you are very, very welcome. I'm very, very happy to have you here. If you want to support us in any way, we don't have a Patreon, we don't have any of that crack. What we do have though is word of mouth. That is the best way to help the show grow and everything like that. So if you've been enjoying the show, or you're liking what you're hearing so far, and you think, Jesus, that lad sounds really nice, really sound, and I would buy him a cup of coffee or a pint if I saw him, save yourself a few quid, recommend the podcast to a friend. That is the handiest thing you can do for the podcast and for myself. I usually don't play any music on the podcast or anything like that, but since the radio show stopped because the college semester stopped, I thought, you know something, I should probably bring back music in some way From the Depths. And that's what we're going to do. So every week going forward now, because I've been sent on quite a bit of music from you guys, from guys in bands and even guys that have little labels and stuff like that saying that you want stuff played. What I'm going to do is every week because the podcast is a podcast and it's mainly for talking and stuff like that. I will end every week's episode with a piece of music, and that'll be starting this week, and we'll get to that in a little bit. But yeah, another way you can support the show, if you want to follow us on social media, you can do so. On Facebook, we are at From the Depths Metal Radio, and on Instagram, we are at From Depths Metal. Supporting us on those is really, really helpful too, because it helps us acquire interviews and stuff like that. A lot of labels and stuff like that will look at the follower count and look at the engagement and stuff like that with YouTube views, our followings and social media and stuff like that. And that helps them to suss whether or not it's worth their time giving From the Depths a slot in their promotional cycles and stuff like that. I've said it over the past few weeks, got a lot of great interviews coming up over the summer. I am hoping that a few of those aren't affected by my laptop being out of commission, but we shall wait and we shall see. So that is all the housekeeping out of the way. What are we talking about this week? We are talking about the seminal horror classic 1968's Night of the Living Dead. So before we go any further with this week's show, I am going to play ye the audio from the original trailer for Night of the Living Dead. Going back to what I was talking about a few moments ago, it was one of those things I did in my early teens as well, when I was still too scared to get into, like, start watching horror movies. I used to watch those huge long compilations of really old, like, B-movie trailers and video nasty trailers and stuff like that. And I remember seeing the trailer for this in one of those compilations, and it made the film look absolutely terrifying. It made it look absolutely horrifying. And I don't know, I listened back to it without video earlier today, and it sounds very terrifying too, but the film is nowhere near as scary as the trailer. But yeah, that's enough of me talking. Here is the trailer for the 1968 classic Night of the Living Dead.
Welcome to a night of total terror. Night of the living dead, the dead who live on living flesh, the dead whose haunted souls hunt the living whose bodies are the only food for these ungodly creatures. Night of the Living Dead. A bizarre adventure in fear. An experience in shock, more shattering than your strangest nightmare. Night of the Living Dead. A night with the dead who cannot die. A night of total terror. Night of the Living Dead.
Okay, so we're talking about Night of the Living Dead, released in 1968, directed by Mr. George Romero. So before we go anywhere else, let's talk about how the film came about. George Romero, John Russo, and Russell Striner founded the production company The Latent Image in the 1960s, and they primarily focused and produced television commercials. So the trio began to become disenfranchised in making said commercials, and they wanted to capitalise on the popularity of horror movies around the time. Particularly in the UK as well, horror around the 60s, early 70s is particularly popular. You need to think back around this time, you would have had the Hammer horror would have been huge. Christopher Lee as Dracula and Frankenstein, and like Peter Cushing as well, playing so many iconic roles at the time. It was a classic era in horror. I wouldn't be too familiar with which is the golden era. I think the golden era is Universal. I'd imagine this is the silver era of horror at this time. Anyway, and yeah, they wanted to cash in the popularity of horror movies, right? So they contacted a lady by the name of Marilyn Eastman and a man by the name of Carl Hardman, who were president and vice president respectively of Hardman Associates Incorporated, and they wanted to pitch the idea for the at the time untitled horror film that they were planning to make, right? So from here, a production company was formed by Romero, Russo, Struyman, Eastman, and Hardman called Image 10. The initial production budget on Night of the Living Dead was only $6,000, with all production company members investing $600 for a share in the film's profits upon release. This budget of $6,000 was quickly found not to be enough to produce the film, and eventually Image 10 raised $114,000 towards production on Night of the Living Dead, which to the best of my knowledge is just over $800,000 to them. So initially Night of the Living Dead, or what was to become Night of the Living Dead, I should say, it was penned as a horror comedy. It took several different forms before the narrative of the film would eventually be conceived. Aliens were an early key concept in the film. The original idea for the film was revolving around young aliens who visited Earth and befriended teens, and another idea revolved around a young man running away from home only to find rotting corpses, which would later be revealed to have been feasted on by aliens along the road. So yeah, they didn't really know what they wanted to make. They just knew they wanted to make a horror, but there was definitely 101 ideas being thrown about the place before they would get to the idea of the flesh eaters, as we're going to touch on in a moment or so. So Russo was actually the one who decided to follow a narrative about reanimated corpses feasting on the flesh of the living, and wrote the film over 3 days towards the end of 1967. Romero would later go on to state that the pair made plans to expand the film into a trilogy, part 1 being Night of the Living Dead. Aspects and concepts originally intended for part 2 and 3 of this trilogy were used in the film sequels Dawn of the Dead and Day of the Dead. But Russo and Romero have publicly stated on several occasions that the original script of Night of the Living Dead was based off of Richard Matheson's, I think I'm pronouncing that right, I Am Legend. Due to production costs, Night of the Living Dead was filmed on 35mm black and white film, a decision which retrospectively fitted extremely well tonally with the final film. So yeah, lot to take in there. You can tell I was probably reading a lot of that from notes. One thing I learned actually just after finishing the research for this film, and I never knew this and it blew my mind. Russo was actually the main figurehead behind the 80s classic Return of the Living Dead, which is absolutely nothing to do with this film at all. The only thing it has to do with the film is that it was, how do I explain this now? It's kind of like, you know, which ones are these? The Halloween films at Michael Myers, and how the film series has 2 different timelines, or 3 if you include the most recent one. And you can kind of pick which timeline you think is canon or whatever. What Russo was doing with Return of the Living Dead was he was basically giving you an alternative to Romero's narrative that he was going to be exploring more with Dawn of the Dead, and they came out very, very close together and stuff like this. Romero would end up getting a restraining order against Russo, and I'm nearly certain from what I read that they went to court for copyright infringement and everything like this. But I don't think, like, I know Romero had made it known that he was going to be making Dawn of the Dead and everything like this, but the idea originally was Russo's. So, you know, a lot of what would become Night of the Living Dead was very much based off of Romero's vision, but the initial spark, or the initial idea as such for the film definitely came from Russo. So it's hard to pick one over the other there. Both have very, very fair claims to the term Godfather of the zombie. But I think, in hindsight and looking back at it retrospectively, I think what Romero did with the Dead series going forward, it's a more consistent series compared to Return of the Living Dead. I know there's 3 or 4 Return of the Living Dead movies, and from what I've gathered, the quality just goes down drastically with each one. I have seen bits and pieces of the second and third one, but I've never watched them in full. I'll definitely be doing a look back on the Return of the Living Dead series, as I am with the Romero one down the line, but I'll definitely have guests on for that one. Anyway, so I'm after touching off the microphone. Professionalism here. So before we get on to anything else, let's talk about the cast of the film. Alright, great cast in this film. Unfortunately, you don't see many of them in any other pictures after Night of the Living Dead, and for various different reasons. So the cast, you have, I do not know how this is pronounced, right? I don't know if it's pronounced Duan or if it's pronounced Duane, so I'm going to pronounce it Duan. And if I'm pronouncing that wrong, feel free to get in contact, let me know, and I will correct myself in future going forward. So we're Mr. Dwan Jones as Ben, a classically trained stage actor. Dwan Jones would write several of his written lines after outright refusing to cite some of the scripted material. The role of Ben was originally intended to be played by a white southerner, and as such the dialogue was overly simplified. By changing the dialogue and presenting Ben as an intellectual and a survivalist, he helped to make Ben one of the earliest examples of a strong black male lead in cinema. Joanne would die in 1988 at the age of 51. And that creative choice on his side to rework some of the dialogue and stuff like that was a very, very, very good call. I will say a lot of the characters in this film are very, very forgettable. And there's a lot of reasons for that. But the standout by a mile is definitely Ben in this film, and is very much because of Duan or Joanne or whatever it's pronounced. However you pronounce his name, I'm so sorry. I tried by watching a few like mini documentaries about this film as well to see if I could get that pronunciation right. Everyone pronounced it 101 different ways. So annoying. But yeah, he passed away. I think he was 51. Something to do with his heart. I read the thing. I can't remember how it's pronounced, and it's weird. It's something that stops blood flow to the heart. But he was only 51. But yeah, terrible waste. He, from what I've gathered as well, reading up on his IMDb and stuff like that, everything that he was in after Night of the Living Dead wasn't particularly received well, which is an awful shame, because you can tell, particularly that bit where he is taking apart the chair talking to Barbara. The early part of the film, you can see his classical training coming out big time. So yeah, we're talking now about Miss Judith O'Dea, who played the character of Barbara at just 23 at the time of production. Night of the Living Dead would be Judith's first on-screen role after spending the earliest part of her career predominantly in commercials and on stage. Judith is unfortunately one of the only cast members who is still alive, and that is not unfortunate that she is alive. It's unfortunate that a lot of the other cast members are not here today to reap the rewards of their work retrospectively. It's a very, very celebrated movie we're going to be talking about today on the show. Now you got Mr. Carl Hardman, who co-produced the movie as Mr. Harry Cooper. Hardman acted as a producer on Night of the Living Dead, like I just said there, and he also provided the voice of the news reporter that is heard in Johnny's car at the start of the film. You really, really hate Carl Hardman's character throughout this movie, because he really, really comes across as a seedless prick. That's seen at various points. It's seen by he really wants to be the domineering force in the farmhouse. He wants to be calling the shots and everything like this. And it's quite clear to the audience, it's quite clear to the people who are in the farmhouse with him, and it's very, very obvious to his wife that Carl is not the that Harry, is not the guy to be calling the shots. You see his cowardice take proper form as well, in the fact that like he's not the one who goes into the car with Ben to try and put petrol in the tank. And he nearly leaves Ben to die when things go tits up when they go to get that gas, which I'm going to go through the plot as well in a minute now. But yeah, so that's that's Carl Hardman as Harry Cooper. We have Marilyn Eastman as Helen Cooper. Marilyn was another producer in the film, and as well as this, she played one of the undead marching around the house in the latter half of the film, and can be seen eating an insect. She ad-libbed a lot of her dialogue in the film in the same way that Dwayne Jones did with Ben, and in doing so she added layers to the character and helped to prevent her from being a throwaway character. That is particularly true and evident in the argument the two have downstairs while their daughter is slowly dying. Harry is there ranting off like mad, and she's there smoking a cigarette now at the side of her mouth, and she's just there and she's like, that's what's important, being right. And you can just see him, he takes one of those over exaggerated pulls from his cigarette and just fucks it down onto the ground because she knows she's right. Great fucking actress. I really, really enjoyed her in this film now, I must say. Okay, who else we got? We have Keith Wayne as Tom. Biggest shocker now out of all of these, reading up on the cast members. Keith as Tom had this like very all-American, he had this very all-American look about him, and I kind of looking at him in this film, I was kind of just presuming that he was in a lot more things. I knew he obviously didn't make it huge in Hollywood, but I would have presumed that he would have been in a lot more things, even television. Like, do you know what I mean? Like, I could easily see him as like as a serial actor of such, or in like a television series or something like that, playing like, you know, All American Good Guy or whatever. But this was actually his one and only on-screen appearance in film or in television. Keith would leave acting after doing Night of the Living Dead, and beforehand as well, he was one of the frontmen of a dance group during his college days, which would have only been a few years before this. He would later go on to become a chiropractor, and then even stranger, he died by suicide at the age of 50 in 1995. Terrible waste. One of the books he published as a chiropractor as well, very close to his death, was actually titled like the death of Dr. Keith Wayne or something like that. It was very harrowing and stuff like that. But yeah, it was the biggest shock to read up anyway when doing the research for this film. And last but not least, there is obviously more members of the cast, but I'm only going to be talking about really the people that were inside in the farmhouse when we're talking about the cast. We have Miss Kyra shown as Karen. So Kyra was Hardman's real life daughter, and she also played the mangled corpse at the top of the stairs found by Barbara in the earlier part of the film. She is also the iconic. She is one of the most iconic characters in this film. The shot of her feasting on her mother's flesh towards the end of the film, that's an iconic scene in itself, as well as the scene before where she kills her, of course. Really cool psychedelic kind of effect with that, with the soundtrack going on. It's excellent stuff. There is a very famous image from this film of a young zombie looking dead-eyed into the camera. It's an iconic shot. A lot more people know of that image, actually more so than the film. And that's her in that shot too. I've actually shared on the From the Depths Instagram page. That is the image that is up on that. You can see it's so iconic. It's so good. So yeah, one quick thing before we go any further. We're 25 minutes into this episode now. If you have not watched this film before, lads, I really strongly recommend that you don't listen to any more of this, and that you go and watch Night of the Living Dead. And you can watch it for free. You can watch it for free on YouTube. And the reason for it, which I'm going to touch on later, is this film has no copyright. So it is in public domain, and you can freely watch it online and not worry about your internet provider cutting off your service or the guards crashing through your window because you pirated a DVD. Yeah, so there's several different versions of it on YouTube as well for free. So feel free to dig into that. Come back to us here when you have the film watched. And yeah, cool. So I'm going to go through the plot with you, for you now. As a refresher before we go any further, if you haven't watched the film like I just said, please go and watch it. You're doing yourself a disservice having it all spoiled for you. It is a great film, and the first viewing of this in particular is a great one. It's still good with time, but I don't think I've ever watched it and had as much of a kick watching as I did the first time. So yeah, I'm going to be reading a script for this one now, guys, for the next minute or two while I go on about the plot of the film. So do excuse my droll voices I read. Okay, so cool. Brother and sister Johnny and Barbara are travelling to place a wreath upon their father's grave. After spending most of the journey complaining about the length of the trip, Johnny begins teasing Barbara, and the pair begin to bicker. A man wearing a worn-down suit approaches the two, attacks Barbara. Johnny intervenes, and the scuffle begins between the two. The man knocks Johnny to the ground. He cracks his head against a tombstone, killing him. Barbara flees to an abandoned farmhouse upon seeing more individuals in a similar state to the man who just killed her brother beginning to occupy the cemetery and beginning to pursue her. When she enters the house, she finds presumably the woman who owned the house half-eaten at the top of the stairs. This sends Barbara into a catatonic state from shock, given everything that has just happened. Luckily for her, a man named Ben reveals himself as he begins to board up the house and drives the figures pursuing Barbara away with fire. Once the house is boarded up, Barbara and Ben both tell each other how they ended up at the farmhouse. Barbara begins rambling hysterically to which Ben hits her, knocking her out. Quick note on that. I don't know if it was a fuck up with the Foley sound engineer on this, but it's not a backhanded slap or anything like that. The other way in movies is the cliche when someone's like going like mad ranting, they just they get slapped across the face and it's like, sort your shit out, like, do you know what I mean? Ben hits her with a closed fist, and it's not like it's a doom, and she just drops. Weirdest thing about this film is definitely seeing like the contrast in societal norms then compared to now. If you know what I mean, if you had a film released now and you had a fella hitting a girl with a glow assist, that is instantly what's it? That becomes an 18 plus. I think. I don't think you can get 16s with that. I'm not too sure. After yawning into the microphone, my apologies. Anyway, back to the plot of the film. A few moments later, two men emerge from the farmhouse cellar. Harry Cooper and from the farmhouse cellar. Harry Cooper and Tom. Harry and his wife Helen have been taking refuge in the basement after a group of ghouls overturned their car and bit their daughter Karen. Tom and his girlfriend Judy took refuge with the Coopers in the cellar after hearing an emergency broadcast about a series of brutal murders. Ben and Harry immediately begin to argue over Harry not intervening when he heard the commotion upstairs. When Ben was fighting off several of the ghouls outside the farmhouse, as they bicker, an emergency broadcast about the widespread murders commences on the radio and television. The broadcast states how there has been a wave of mass murders being committed across the eastern coast of the United States by an army of reanimated corpses who are eating those they kill. The television broadcast shows an army of civilians patrolling the streets and opening fire on the reanimated corpses. During the broadcast, a list of medical centres acting as safe houses scrolls across the bottom of the screen. When the survivors see that there is a medical centre just a few miles away, they begin to put plans in place to get themselves there before they become overrun in the farmhouse by the Walking Dead. Harry Cooper continues to argue with Ben, imploring that the survivors need to seek refuge in the cellar instead of risking their lives by attempting to flee. Ben and Tom make a plan to get the truck outside the house to a gas pump just beyond the farmhouse, and using it to get all of them to the medical centre. While Ben and Tom make their way to the van, Harry launches Molotov cocktails at the ghouls to keep them at a distance. When Ben, Tom and Harry begin acting out their plan, Judy follows Ben and Tom to the truck. When they reach the gas pump, Tom accidentally sprays diesel on Ben's flaming torch, which sets a tyre on fire. God, that was hard to say. Tom and Judy drive forward in the hopes it will put the flame out. Unfortunately for them, the car implodes, leaving Ben to make his way to the farmhouse while more and more undead gather around the house. When he finally makes it back to the house, Harry almost doesn't open the door for him, instead hovering around the cellar door. He eventually lets Ben in, who punches Harry for almost abandoning him. We see the ghouls eating the charred remains of Tom and Judy, who at this point have been spread across the garden of the farmhouse. The dead eventually garner enough numbers, to try and force their way into the house. Ben turns and shoots Harry. Harry stumbles into the cellar, dying on the cellar floor. Karen dies and reanimates. She's then found by her mother, Helen, feasting on her father's remains. Karen then murders her mother with a spade. During the charge, the undead break down the barricade in the front door and begin to gain access to the house. We see Barbara's brother Johnny amongst the mob, who helps drag her into the horde of the dead. This is the last time we see Barbara, who is presumably murdered and eaten by the dead. The horde overrun the house. Ben is forced to take refuge in the cellar, where he finds the half-eaten corpse of Harry Cooper, Helen Cooper's corpse with a spade in her chest, and their daughter Karen, blood-soaked and approaching him. Ben shoots Karen down and then shoots Harry and Helen in the head to ensure they don't reanimate. By morning, the mob of the undead have seemingly migrated elsewhere, with few remaining around the farmhouse. A group of police and volunteers who've been shooting down the undead make their way towards the farmhouse. Ben makes his way out of the cellar and sees him approaching. The group mistake him for one of the undead and they shoot him dead. The film ends with stills of Ben's body being picked up by hooks and added to a pile of bodies which are about to be set alight to ensure that they don't reanimate. So that is the plot to 1968's Night of the Living Dead. If you've just sat through that and allowed me to spoil all of it for you, shame on you, because you've just robbed yourself of a genuinely thoroughly enjoyable cinematic experience. And like I said, you can watch that movie for free online. You can watch it in colour. You can watch an original copy of the original tape too, with all its flaws and imperfections visually left into, like little black spots in the film and stuff like that. But yeah, there is genuinely 101 different versions of that film to watch on YouTube, and I recommend checking out at least one of them. And look, if you're coming into this and you haven't seen the film in a few years, I recommend going back and checking it out too. I decided about 2 weeks ago I was going to do podcasts about these films, and just this day last week I sat down and watched this film for the first time in about 3 years. And oh my god, I had such crack watching it. It's such good. It's the pacing is great. It's the pacing in this film is great. It doesn't. It's not moving too fast. Not moving too slow. There's a lot going on. One point I forgot to mention when going on about the plot of this film too is that the reason that the dead are reanimating, which is so strange, is there is a satellite in space or a space shuttle that was coming from Venus or Mars, and it came into Earth's orbit, it released rays, and these rays are causing the dead to reanimate and begin eating the flesh of other people. Another note to make of this film is there's always the cliche that zombies are looking to eat brains and stuff like that. This is not mentioned or implied at any point in Night of the Living Dead, and this cliche actually comes about through the Return of the Living Dead series that I mentioned a few minutes ago. So yeah, that's that cliche out of the water and stuff like that anyway. So cool. Let's talk about the post-production this one, right? So I didn't really get into too much about the production of this film. There's nothing really of interest. The film was made for next to nothing. If you know anything about filmmaking and stuff like that, even independent, like low budget films, they do cost quite a lot of money to make. So penny pinching was very much a prominent thing to be found on the set of Night of the Living Dead. Many people that are involved in production would play like members of the undead. Locals as well, where they filmed, offered to play zombies for free to be in the film. The term zombie actually as well that I mentioned is never used. They're normally called like ghouls or like flesh eaters or stuff like that, or murderers for 90% of the film, but they're never called zombies. To the best of my knowledge, I can't remember they ever called zombies in the Romero films. That's something that we'll have to explore over the next few weeks. So yeah, it was where are we now? I'm here looking at my notes. Okay, so the working title of the film was actually Night of the Flesh Eaters, right? And they collectively decided towards the end of the production, they were kind of like, you know something, we should go ahead with Night of the Living Dead as opposed to Night of the Flesh Eaters, like, you know. So the copyright had been put out for Night of the Flesh Eaters, but for one reason or another, someone just forgot to put the copyright out for Night of the Living Dead, and as such, it became public domain once the film was released. I'd imagine that, you know, Romero and Co still made money from, like, obviously from the film screenings and stuff like that, but definitely not as much as they could, because of the fact that they didn't own the copyright to Night of the Living Dead. The film became public domain. It's why you can watch it on YouTube for free and everything like that, because essentially nobody owns it because it's not copyrighted. And as such, a load of people have put out different DVDs of this. Every time it airs on television, no one has to be paid. You can find television trailers for, I think it was at 1985, whenever Day of the Dead came out, there was a television screening, the first television screening of Night of the Living Dead in colour, and I know they were showing that and Dawn of the Dead back to back, but they didn't have to pay to screen Night of the Living Dead and stuff like that. But you can watch that trailer, or you can watch that ad, I should say, online. I actually just added on this morning, just came up on my YouTube suggested. All of my YouTube suggested now is nothing but George Romero zombie related now as a result of researching for this podcast, but sure, look, I don't really mind that. Anyway, so other than that, the majority of the film score was actually compiled of recycled scores from other films and television shows, and the opening title theme that plays when the car is going towards the cemetery, and when Barbara and Johnny are bickering in the car and the title card comes up, that can actually be found on an episode of a television show called Ben Casey, titled I Remember a Lemon Tree. So yeah, cool little factoid there about the theme music and everything. This is often called the most independent movie of independent movies and stuff like that. And stuff like that is further proof to the fact. So yeah, there was a lot of controversy surrounding the release of this film now when it came out. When the movie came out, the MPAA rating system, which is basically it deems which films are age appropriate and for what groups and everything like that. You wouldn't even realise the importance of it now, but just for context, I was giving you a contemporary example of this now. Imagine that the MPAA didn't exist, or any type of a censorship board. Now, I often do give out about censorship and stuff like this, but in the case of film, when it comes to age restriction, is very much needed. Could you imagine if a Serbian film somehow was mass released, right? And you had, the kids would start hanging out in town around maybe 10 or 12, let's say their parents give them X amount to go to the cinema, and there's no age restriction or anything like that, and you have a bunch of kids going in to watch a Serbian film. Fuck me. There'd be war. Well, that's exactly what happened here. You need to think back to 1968. There wasn't that much really shocking films out there. Night of the Living Dead was very, very groundbreaking in that sense. Particularly, there was a lot of backlash over Karen killing her parents and eating them, pretty much. Especially that scene where she has the spade and she's stabbing her mother continuously. That was widely condemned by people around the time of the film's release. So it was released on October 1st, 1968, and like I said, the MPA rating system wasn't put into place until the following month, meaning that anyone of any age could purchase a ticket to any screening, I should say, without any issue. Well, I tell you something, they were left screaming after they went and watched it anyway. The film was screened as a Saturday matinee, meaning it was mainly children and adolescents purchasing tickets to see the film. Cinemas across the United States were inundated with complaints from parents who were having to deal with children who had been essentially traumatized by the violence of Night of the Living Dead. Beyond tame by 2021 standards, but groundbreaking in the late 1960s between the violence, cannibalism, and the very, very bleak ending. The film was essentially ignored by critics around the time of its release, bar those criticising its violence. And in the decades that have passed since the film's release, it is now universally praised as a classic of the horror genre and one of the most groundbreaking cinematic releases of the 1960s. The film helped launch both the splatter genre, and it is recognised as the first zombie movie ever made, despite the fact that the term zombie is again never mentioned at any point throughout the film. The film would spawn several sequels, 2 remakes, and a half-century worth of impersonations. So that is pretty much all I have to say about 1968's Night of the Living Dead. Like I've said at several points already throughout this episode of From the Depths, this is one of my favourite movies of all time. And look, I'm telling you now, if you haven't watched this film and I've spoiled all of it for you, do you know, to be honest with you, not having faces to the characters' names would actually help prevent spoiling it, I think. Because with the exception of Ben and Barbara and maybe Harry, I didn't really know any of these characters' names until I actually went and researched it after decided to this episode of the podcast. And bear in mind, this is someone who's watched the film quite a lot. I've seen this film, I'd say, 15 times. But yeah, I can't recommend it enough. It's just such a great film. And it's one of those films you don't have to. It's one of those films you don't really have to be like overly consciously aware of what's going on all the time. It's very much fed to you. It is like the best example of a Saturday night movie, like a mindless movie. You just want to walk in and get entertained. It's that. It's 1968. 1968's Night of the Living Dead. One of my favourite films of all time, but good reason. If this is your first time even hearing someone talking about the film, just please go out and watch it. I think it's going to be a running joke now after I release this episode, and when I talk with friends, anyone who listens to this, once I've had a drink or two, they'll turn around and they'll be like, Emmett, please watch Night of the Living Dead. And you know something, I'm very, very tempted to stick it on again now, even though I watched it only a week ago. It's such a great fucking film. So yeah, that is 1968's Night of the Living Dead. I don't know if I said this at the start of the episode. I've said it on the From the Depths social media pages. We will be taking a look at the next 2 George Romero zombie movies over the following 2 weeks. So next week we are going to be looking at Dawn of the Dead. Many of you know it. It is the first one that Tom Savini is involved with. Tom Savini is, of course, a legendary horror makeup artist. He was involved in the Friday the 13th series, and as well as he's been involved in loads. He's been involved in loads of classic films. I would nearly imagine I'd be doing a podcast about Tom Savini on his own, with no films being talked about at some point down the line. And it's entirely set in a shopping mall. It is probably the most celebrated movie of the series. Now, I think in total there's 6 films in the George Romero Dead series. I am only going to be covering the first 3. I may come back to the other 3 down the line, but we'll wait and see. I have to remember as well that this is also a heavy metal podcast too, so I got to make room to talk about albums and stuff too. And by the time that this little series of George Romero retrospectives is done and dusted, we're going to have lost out nearly a month, so I'm going to have to get back cracking with the metal as soon as we are back doing those episodes, which I'd imagine would be the last week in June. Okay, like I was saying at the very start of the episode, I'm going to be closing off episodes of the podcast going forward with a bit of music for you, because we've been saying quite a lot of it over the past few weeks, and since the radio show isn't back on the air until September, this is a great way to get some of your guys' music played. So a lovely lad by the name of Jim was in contact with me this morning about asking if I'd play a tune by his group, and that is, of course, absolutely no issue whatsoever. Can I just give an absolute fucking sincere shout out to the best name for a band I've heard in a long time. The band name is Hashmaker. They have a single coming out on Monday, June 7th, called Queens of the Steamed Hams, and you're going to be getting an exclusive first listen to it here on From the Dip. So huge shout out to Jim Orfer and Hashmaker. Lads, this is Hashmaker with Queens of the Steamed Hams. I will catch you next week, where we'll be talking about Dawn of the Dead. So until next week, good night and God bless, and enjoy a bit of Hashmaker.
Coming to get you, Barbara.